Thank you so much for your patience, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the Identifying Challenges in Writing Across Borders workshop series. I think it's time for us to kick off the session. Firstly, I would like to make a land acknowledgement that Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. I am new to this land as an immigrant settler, and I'm very much look forward to exploring and learning from this land and from our indigenous communities. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Yuni Chen. I am an educational developer at the Center for Teaching and Learning. I am originally from China, and I speak English as my second language. I moved to Canada in 2012 as an international student and became a Canadian permanent resident in 2018. While I was pursuing my degree, I encountered and overcame many challenges, one of which was related to academic writing and more specifically, citation conventions in practice. Okay, so I'm not really approaching this topic as an expert, but from the perspective of a struggling student and also curious educational developer who really wanted to understand what had caused my struggles in citation practices. So I delved into this issue firstly as a graduate student and then carried the research into my professional life, whereby I became cognizant the role culture played in citation practices and in academic writing. I'm very excited to have you all in the session today. It's my pleasure to have you, and I look forward to discussing this topic with you and with our panelists who will be approaching this topic from more of an expert perspective. I'm not sure if Ian is here, one of our panelists. He mentioned he has a class until 10:20 and he'll be rushed back to his office. So I guess I'll just do the housekeeping and then do the introduction of our panelists. So hopefully Ian will be here soon. Just very quick housekeeping item of the session today, that this is going to be a conversational session in which I'll be sharing some of my research, but also invite our panelists to add their voices and perspectives. Okay, I was just saying this is going to be a conversational session, and I will invite the panelists to join me to share their perspective and voices as I share my research with everyone. I also invited Amir as our student panelist to share his voice as a student into our conversation. So I would hope to invite everybody to join us in the conversation. I hope you feel comfortable to ask questions, making comments, and sharing your own story or thoughts as we process the session. If you don't feel comfortable speaking up, you can always use a live chat to communicate with us. If you have questions, our panelists will try to answer your question. And yeah, if you feel comfortable, I always invite you to unmute yourself and share. I'm not sure when Ian will be here, so maybe we can begin the introduction of our panelists, and I'll ask Ian to introduce himself once he's in the session. May I suggest that Matt, you go first, and then Amir.
Sure, thank you very much, Yuni. Ian just joined the conversation, so he's here. My name is Matt Rahimian, and I'm the Academic Integrity Coordinator in the Office of the Provost and Vice Principal Academic. I work from home, which is the traditional land of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe in Hamilton area. And yeah, I have served in the role of Academic Integrity Coordinator at Queen's. I started it recently in June, to be specific. Before that, I worked in a number of universities and colleges in Ontario, Manitoba, and overseas. Now, one fun fact is that Yuni and myself used to be classmates when we were doing graduate studies. And then we lost track of each other somehow. And then suddenly we found ourselves working at Queen's University. Such a coincidence. Yeah, that's me. And I would welcome your comments and ideas on whatever we say here today. Thank you very much. And Amir, take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Amir. I study computer engineering, and I'm in second year in my PhD. I am struggling to write my comprehensive exam, and I'm happy to be here and take your questions.
Thank you so much, Matt and Amir. Ian just arrived. So Ian, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Perfect. Hi, everybody. So my name is Ian Garner. I am the Outreach Manager at Student Academic Success Services. So I'm the kind of student-facing person on the panel, and we often deliver academic integrity tutorials, workshops to students.
Okay, welcome Ian, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to have all the panelists to join me today to share your voices and expertise and perspectives. So before we officially move into the session, I would like to have an open communication with you in terms of the intentions and goals of the session to hopefully avoid some miscommunications or misinterpretations. The session really aims to help educators identify international students' challenges in citation practices through a cultural perspective, because any misconduct in citation practices may likely to lead our students to the issue of plagiarism. And I have no intention to simplify either citation practices or plagiarism, as I understand and acknowledge that they are complicated issues and with different manifestations across disciplines and subject fields. Okay, due to time limitation, I can only discuss them as general concepts in the session today to differentiate from the practices or understanding our students have or have not previously adopted. And you may also notice as we process that some of the challenges may not be unique to our international students, but to diverse student groups we have in our classroom. For example, first generation college students or students from diverse high school experiences, our Francophone students, our students from indigenous communities. We can all name a few because the goal for this whole session and the whole workshop series is really to inspire ideas to help all students who are struggling in academic writing to achieve success. Okay, so to reiterate what we have discussed in the previous sessions, while our international students bring widely different skill sets and educational backgrounds into our classrooms, they also encounter unique challenges. Based on research studies, their challenges include, but not limited to, instructional methods, assignment requirements, and writing styles that are different from what they experienced in their home countries. Okay, among the many challenges, academic writing, critical analysis, and citation skills are topics that some international students identified as their major challenges in study. And this research actually aligns really well with my lived experience as a former international student. So I was inspired to compose the workshop series with 3 sessions, each addressing one challenge. In the first and second sessions, we discovered cultural diversity in academic writing and critical thinking. And in today's session, we're going to explore the challenges related to citation practices. Okay, based on research study, some international students are reported to feel confused, not only about when and how to cite, but also why to cite in English academic writing. I think I was one of them. Unfortunately, when students seem to commit misconduct in citation or referencing, our institutional solution often fail to further explore the possible reasons, but threaten our students with punishment. Okay, so that's the very reason we need to start thinking about the possible reasons behind or underneath their misconduct. Okay, so the learning outcomes of the session, I'm trying something new here, as you may have noticed. Instead of listing a few bullet points to say we're going to define something, identify or explore, I would like to leave it up to you to answer the key questions using your main takeaway from the session today. I hope you're able to use your own words to answer the two important questions. What challenges our international students in citation practices that may lead to academic integrity departures, for example, plagiarism? And also, what might be the strategies we can implement in practice to help international students with their challenges in citation practices, so as to help them avoid plagiarism in our specific disciplinary fields or academic contexts. Okay, so two important questions for us to explore in the session today. But before we start sharing some of the research, I would like to invite you to do a quick brainstorming activity to think about the first question, like what might be the challenges for our international and many other students to practice citation conventions. I would like to invite everybody to use your smartphone or any device you are using to go to www.menti.com and enter the code 39436443, whereby you will be able to answer this question. And please feel free to post as many times as you want to. We have about 3 or 4 minutes for this quick activity. And my colleague Sandra already shared the link and code in the chat for your convenience. So I will also switch my screen over to the activity so we can see the answers that come in. Okay. So hopefully you're able to see the screen of the activity, and I can see we have answers coming in here. Quoting, paraphrasing well. Yes, it's a skill. It's a skill that needs a lot of practice. Okay, very good answer. What's common knowledge? Exactly. I think you read my mind, because common knowledge is something not universal. Something considered common knowledge in my culture might not be considered a common knowledge. And there's always different rules and regulations in terms of what to cite, what not to cite. There's something called secondary citation. There's something called self-plagiarizer. Those are things I've never experienced before I moved over to Canada. And I can saw Amir nodding away. So we share the same challenges, I guess. Not knowing the difference between common knowledge and something that is exactly. Difficulty with second language. Yes, language is always a bummer. Different citation styles required across courses. Yes, if we are taking different courses, we might be using different rules of citation, could be APA, MLA, or even, Chicago. It could be confusing for new students for sure. Unclear about what extent needs to be attributed to another. Yes, exactly. Translation. Yes, it's difficult to paraphrase another if English is your second language and it often doesn't add any value or improvements. Yeah, and oftentimes there is no direct translation between languages. That's exactly a very good point. What appropriate source to use? No idea how to rewrite in my own words. What I would write would be so poor in comparison. Yes, I feel so much related to this answer because to me, I also speak English as a second language. So my understanding is there's no way for me to write better than the scholars. So I would prefer to use others' words to make my paper look smart. If I write in my own words, I have the worry that it may look like less qualified or less professional. Okay, so thank you so much for your contribution to this question. I think it's time for us to switch back to the PowerPoint. Just give me one quick second here. Let me switch back. Okay, I hope you can now see my PowerPoint. Okay. Thank you again for your contribution to this quick activity. Let's continue our conversation. Okay, I would like to very quickly point out the issue of plagiarism. In general, is often the outcome of many complex and culturally situated influences. However, the traditional North American notion of plagiarism often fails to take into account of students who write in English as an additional language and come from different educational and cultural backgrounds. The most frequently referenced but also debated cultural influences in citation practices include, but not limited to, the issues of ownership, originality, and also different norms of attribution, as we've already alluded previously. Okay, so this is not to say that there are only 3 cultural factors that impact our citation practices. Once again, due to the time constraints I have, I would like to use them only as exemplars, and there are in fact many other cultural factors wait for us to study and discover. So for this topic, I'm happy to talk for like 6 hours nonstop, but I don't think that's the case for today. So we can do as the best we can in the session to share some ideas with you. Okay, so first thing first, ownership and plagiarism. Okay, I think we can all agree that in North American contexts, for example, at Queen's, the issue of plagiarism has often been seen as a product of the notion of ownership. So the ownership needs to be protected. However, in many other cultures, there exist different understandings of ownership that may not necessarily align with the notion prevalent in North America or in our university. So I have an example here for you. Okay, so collectivism is a strong cultural tradition rooted in many countries across the world. Somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Africa, around the world, people have this cultural orientation. Okay, where the idea of communal ownership is widely accepted. Okay, in collectivistic culture, community rather than individual interests are seen as essential for societal harmony and functioning. Therefore, the belief prevalent in our context that ideas and words can be owned by individuals may seem very strange to students from this collectivistic cultural backgrounds, especially the ones without or with very limited experience in English academic writing, or even in academic writing in general. If you have never experienced academic writing, so you're more leaning towards the belief that, you know, nobody owns ideas or words if you are from this kind of cultural backgrounds. Okay, so the students may likely to believe words are shared assets, not personal belongings, and knowledge is owned by the society rather than by individuals. Okay, following this kind of ideology without clear instructions or guidance, some students from collectivistic cultural backgrounds may likely to pursue the writing task in line with their educational backgrounds or cultural conventions, meaning they may copy chunks of text in writing without considering this as a violation of attribution, but as a positive collaboration of ideas, or they may regard the North American rules of citation or quotation as being inappropriate or unnecessary. Okay, and these practices, as we can see here, will easily be accused of plagiarism at our school and will have severe consequences. Okay, so this is the first cultural factor in terms of different beliefs or different understanding of ownership. Okay, before I keep going to the next culture point, I wonder if our panelists would like to share some thoughts or have comments.
Yeah, if I may, Yunyi, I think, you know, we saw this issue of common knowledge brought up by a couple of people on the little Mentimeter activity. I think this is often where students can get baffled by the idea of common knowledge, and especially disciplinary common knowledge. That in certain instances, we tell students that all text must be attributed that it belongs to the author. But if it's common knowledge, then it doesn't need to be. And then as they go further on in their degree programs, they start to see that there's a very specific element of disciplinary common knowledge where, for example, chemists will regularly discuss a particular idea that would make no sense to physicists, let alone English literature professors or business commerce professors, right? And suddenly what becomes common knowledge is actually the boundaries shift. The common knowledge, when we tell students common knowledge is common, what we're actually talking about is something that isn't limitless. And so I think what we'll come back to throughout this session is the idea that modeling is extremely important for students, and talking through the decision-making processes that we're making when we're doing writing, instead of just giving them feedback that is, this should have been referenced, or why should have been referenced, when in what seemed to the students like very parallel examples may not have required a reference at all.
Thank you so much, Ian. I think you just enriched our conversation here. Like I already shared, common knowledge is not universal, right? So there needs to be an explanation clearly at the onset of the course in terms of what may or might need to be cited. So I wonder if anybody from our group here has anything to share in terms of your own experience, maybe as a student or maybe as an educator, your comments. I see Keisha says here, I think there should also be consideration that common knowledge is not static. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for sharing. I would like to encourage everybody to communicate with us as we process the session, because I really want to learn from you. I think it's a great opportunity for us to communicate and learn from each other. Okay, so let me move on to the next point. Which is a time for our student voice. Amir will share a story in relation to ownership because he has experience in writing academic papers, both in his first language, Farsi, and in English. So Amir, let me hand the floor over to you now.
Well, sure. So I study computer engineering, and a couple of months ago, when my supervisor and I were discussing about my proposal, and I designed an algorithm that was related to my field of study in that meeting. And after performing the feasibility studies, my supervisor told me that, hey, your idea is already implemented and tested before by quite a number of researchers, and you don't own the original ideas. So I asked him what I should do. Can I write about it in my thesis? I was shocked a little bit. And he told me, don't worry about it. Those ideas are not yours. You'll still get the ownership of applying them to your new context. So I realized that I have to cite the previous authors appropriately for developing their ideas in my thesis, and to cite them and acknowledge them for developing those ideas in their context. So right now I'm writing in English as opposed to writing in Persian, which is my first language, for my master thesis. I constantly feel the anxiety more than necessary that I need to make sure not to write any ideas that are not mine. And honestly, the language barrier has made this process for the literature study much more challenging for me, because, I can read the articles, I can read the thesis before, that was written before me, but to fully understand and remember which study did what takes much more time from me. And I sometimes feel terrified of being accused of plagiarism because I didn't properly or appropriately cited the common knowledge or not uncommon knowledge. So let's say about it. So that was my story, I guess.
Thank you so much, Amir. While you were sharing your story, it occurs to me that I have some kind of related but also different experience. While I'm doing research to put together this workshop, I read a few journals that writes about Chinese ways of writing. I feel a lot of ideas I already know if I read those journals, while I still have to cite the scholar when I'm sharing these ideas about my culture. So that to me is also a challenge. If I never read the journal, I would definitely not cite any of the scholars. I will think they're my ideas, but they already exist, other people did the study. So it's also a challenge for me to realize, okay, should I cite or not cite? Even I consider those are my knowledge. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a follow-up question for you because you have experience both in writing in your first language and in English. Can you quickly share a few thoughts in terms of, do you think it helps that you learned academic writing in your first language? Do you think that helps you manage your English academic writing in terms of citation practices?
Well, of course. Well, you know, I will talk about it in future slides as well. But you know, universities in developing countries has been trying to integrate the academic policies into their own culture, and because of that, I've had sort of more or less the same you know learning process as a native speaker, as a native student here, to go through the academic integrity policies and norms. But you know, sometimes they are not practiced you know heavily as they practiced here. So and I think we will discuss it in the future slides as well. You know, the terms of academic integrity and plagiarism sometimes are much more subjective than we're talking about them in here. And I guess, you know, when people wants to decide and judge whether it is a plagiarism or not, then there comes the differences between their ideas. And I think I was lucky that I did my master's in Iran, but I think that any student that come for their studies in master's, studying their master's in Canada, they feel much easier to understand. And you know, I need to just integrate and migrate those two academic cultures, and that was hard for me, and still. So I think those students who started their studies here as their master's or as a graduate student here, they feel more comfortable around those norms and regulations.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Amir, because I guess what I hear is it's a challenge either way, right? If you come, you know, without any academic writing skills, it might be easier for you to understand a new rule, but you have to learn it. It's not something you can automatically understand or pick up. If you have already had academic writing experience in a different language, so the rules may look subjective, you still have to learn about it. Okay, thank you so much for sharing. I guess as educators, it's important for us to keep this in mind. If we have students coming from different linguistic, educational, cultural backgrounds, it is going to be a challenge for them to pick up the different skills in citations. And it's also not easy for our domestic students because academic language is nobody's mother tongue. Okay, so let's move on to the next culture point, which is about the connections between originality and plagiarism. Okay, so as we're aware, in North America, the issue of plagiarism often depends on the concept of originality, aka making it new. Okay, it boils down to demarcation of one's own ideas and words against those from outside sources or from others. So this concept of originality may look a matter of general understanding, but is in fact less familiar in some cultures than others. It is not a universal understanding as well. Okay, so I have an example here. Okay, in some cultures, originality actually means doing it the way it has been done, which has nothing to do like the concept of making something brand new. Okay, this might be a surprising point for some of us who never heard of it. So I'm happy to further explore this culture point. But before that, I wanted to invite our panelists to have some initial thoughts, share with us in terms of originality and plagiarism.
Yunyi, if I may, it's the concept of originality, like any other concept, has some meanings associated with that. For example, when I'm driving down the street and I see a circular sign with a P inside that, I know that sign means no parking here. Now, when it comes to terms that we use in language, it's similar. When we say originality and we talk about that at Queen's University or University of Toronto, then there are different things come to mind compared to when we talk about originality in a different country. As you mentioned, when we say originality in some cultures, it means that it comes from certain roots. It's founded somewhere. But in similar situations in North America, when we say originality, it brings different things to mind. And it means that, okay, you have done your work with the background, with past, and now you give something new, which has origins in you. So those different things we need to be cautious of when we talk about originality, when we talk about plagiarism. So what do we mean? Similar is true for plagiarism. We have to demystify that first for ourselves and then for our students. What do we exactly mean by plagiarism? What precludes plagiarism and what excludes that? And academic integrity, and so many other concepts that we want to talk about. So be mindful of those semiotic meanings that have become so common and internalized in our brains that we might assume that everybody thinks of them the same way. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. Other panelists, do you have any thoughts to share at this point?
Well, I have a story to share about this. So a while ago, my lab mates and I had a meeting, had a group meeting. It was pre-pandemic era, so it was a really pleasant meeting at that time. And we were discussing one of my lab mates' issues in his master's thesis. And after that meeting, well, it was, I didn't have so much in research to do. So I take the time and I designed and implemented an algorithm that solved that problem. It was very short, algorithm. It wasn't such a big deal. So we talked about later with our supervisor and how we came up with this idea. And to my surprise, my supervisor insisted that I need to be cited in my friend's thesis. And then we had a couple of meetings afterwards to differentiate between the ideas. And I was like, hey, I'm okay. I don't really care. But he was like, the originality and authorship of the work is very important in Canada. And, that was the first time that I was culturally shocked by the fact that intellectual property is taken very seriously compared to my home country. So yeah, that was it.
Thank you so much, Amir. So I want to hand the floor over to everybody in the session. Now we kind of talk about two cultural factors in terms of their impact on citation practices. I think some of our participants in the session are also graduate students from diverse cultural backgrounds and disciplinary backgrounds. I wonder if you have any questions at this point, something you would like to share, or if you have a comment in terms of, what we should do better as a university in supporting our students. So I will give you a few minutes to pause here. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking up, please feel free to use the live chat. I really want to hear from you and learn from you and to see how you are thinking right now, what might be your reflections or what might be bothering you at this point. So I'll mute myself and I will let you think or organize your thoughts for a while. Okay, Sean has a question here. Is it possible that students complete a mandatory training on plagiarism and citation? Matt, I will give the question to you and to answer.
Sure, yeah, some universities and colleges across the world make it mandatory for students to finish an academic integrity module that doesn't focus just on plagiarism and citation and cheating, but also in the broader sense. Now, that's something that I would encourage instructors to tailor into the programs. And there are so many reasons behind that. For example, one of them is disciplinary practices as they are related to citation. For example, somebody who is studying to become a nurse needs to follow certain conventions of academic integrity compared to someone who is studying to become a computer software engineer. So depending on that, it's different. Plus, I want to just pass on the board or the floor to Ian to talk about the wonderful academic integrity module that they developed in their center. And that's something that could be introduced and integrated into the course as well. And then it could be tailored. After that, the instructor could add to that to include the conventions of the practice into the academic integrity module. I don't know, Ian.
Thanks, Matt. You knew that I would want to mention this. I appreciate that. I apologize to everybody else. This is going to be a 30-second marketing pitch. So we actually have, I've just put the URL in the chat box there, a little generic academic integrity module that students can work through. And it basically does exactly what Matt described. It's not just about cheating and punitive measures, but about thinking how this is kind of values-based as well. And indeed, as Matt mentioned, we also will work with instructors to tailor material for either courses or departments. So this year we had every graduate engineering student do a tailored version of this. And, they had to register their completion. We had incoming film and media students, undergraduates, do a version of this. And we'll also go into classrooms just before this session. This is why I was 5 minutes late. I was working with some second year politics students on a very specific assignment that they had, talking about paraphrasing of conventions and understanding how this would work in practice. So if anyone has courses or departments that they would like to kind of work through this and make something a bit more tailored, you really are very welcome to reach out to us. And I'll put my email in the chat box as well. And we'll have it at the end too, I think. And we can talk about how to make that work in context.
Thank you so much, Ian and Matt. I think there will be one slide. I think I listed the 3 resources about academic integrity. And Ian can always, refer you to many other great resources SAS has already developed. And both panelists' email will be on the slides as well. And you will be getting my slide after the session, so you will know how to reach out to our panelists after the session. Okay, so hopefully as we process further into the session, everybody feels more comfortable sharing. Because like I said, I really want to hear from you, to listen to your story and learning from you as well. So as I promised, I will further explore the point that originality might have different meanings across diverse cultures. Here is actually one specific example related to different educational strategies. So the rhetoric of imitation is part of the Chinese form of epistemology, which is actually projected in the saying, 温故知新, meaning review the already learned knowledge to gain a new perspective or new understanding, which actually helps us demonstrate how imitation can lead to originality rather than plagiarism. Okay, this is because imitation is considered not simply the recitation of ideas, but rather as a fusion between the reader's process of thinking and that of the thinkers, whereby the readers are able to add their own thinking, add their own thoughts and voices to extend the meaning of the writers, which is considered a means of creation. Okay, I am aware that imitation is a learning strategy that is often looked down upon in the North American context. But based on my own lived experience, educational experience, I would say it is a very valuable strategy in many other cultures or educational systems. Okay, for some of you who have attended session number 2, I think we discussed the reason why imitation and memorization are good strategies for Chinese students and many other students to establish literacy at an early age. And the same counterpoint could also provide us an insight that the link between originality and plagiarism might not always be clear-cut, as a greater degree of imitation in the creation of new ideas is both encouraged and valued in other cultures. when what is meant by originality is not the same as it is in our context or in the North American context, what is meant by plagiarism might also be very different. Okay, and I also would like to reiterate one opinion that when other strategies are different from what we're doing in our specific culture, they're not wrong. Okay, when we think of cultural diversity, when we're working in a culturally diverse classroom, we need to really, I think most of us are already trying to avoid the deficit model. Like our culture does not always have the answer. It's not always right. When our students are educated differently, they're not wrong. They just need our help to adopt a different skill set so they can succeed in our specific context. We should not require them to be fully assimilated in our culture and get rid of their own cultural background. So that's something we should definitely avoid. Okay. So I wonder if anybody has a point to share, comments, questions, thinking of different strategies, originality, and plagiarism.
I just wanted to chip in, especially on this question of the idea of the rhetoric of limitation. And you mentioned the deficit model, and I would argue that this isn't really an international student problem. This isn't really a Chinese student problem. This is, and you forgive me for being glass half empty about this, but this is a sort of universal deficit that students have. And so frequently we work with instructors who complain that their students can't discuss what they're reading. All they do is throw reference after reference after reference in, and they reference beautifully, but they're not using the information for anything. And students come to us, domestic students who are, brilliant high school students from Toronto, from Ottawa, native English speakers, and tell me, I understand exactly how to write. I've read this stuff, but I don't understand what I'm doing with it. And the problem really is, again, in modeling, where are we actually showing, or how are we showing the students where they're headed? Chinese students, yes, but also domestic students, students from Europe, students from all cultures. This is the job of the university, right? To show that. And so often we focus, I think, in our teaching practices on complaining about the things that the students are doing wrong, that we forget that it's our job to actually show them these things.
Matt, you have something to share at this point?
Sorry, did you call on me?
Yes, because I see you turn on your camera. So I was wondering if you want to share something, or if not, we can wait until later.
Sure, I can quickly share something, and Sean has a hand raised. So one quick thing is that part of the enculturation that we need to consider, enculturation. Basically, we are familiarizing students with the academic discourse, how to function in that. Now, one thing to remember, and as Ian was speaking, came to my mind, while we have domestic students in our classes struggling and international students struggling to familiarize themselves with the academic norms and conventions, be mindful of the network of support around our domestic students compared to international students. So international students, in most cases, solely rely on the resources provided by university, while domestic students, in a lot of cases, they have access to so many resources in comparison. That's one thing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. Sean?
I wanted to share, actually, I come from the master's. I'm a first-year master's student in cultural studies, and I'm actually doing some textual analysis right now, and I'm using I'm looking at some of the pedagogies, the Eurocentric pedagogies that create those tensions, because, like, for example, there's like Paulo Freire's idea on the banking system of educate, or I'm just reading now about the destructive pedagogy on the discourse of the master and things like that. So I think a lot of students arrive at university, and I'm certainly had that experience, where we don't have the training in our brain to have an opinion or to go outside the curriculum. And So I just wanted to throw that in the mix of the conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Like every voice matters, because I guess the goal of the session really is to start having a conversation within our community, especially our teaching community. I do echo what our panelists and shared that, this is a culture issue, but it goes beyond a culture issue. That doesn't mean culture doesn't play a role. And oftentimes we don't necessarily are aware of the impact of the culture piece. When we talk about academic writing, it's always about the language barrier. Yes, it's a big barrier, but also the role culture plays should not be ignored. And we should also stereotype any students from a different cultural background, okay? Because I am Chinese, I base a lot of my strategy or research on the Chinese context, but I'm not a representative of Chinese culture, or I'm not saying every Chinese student will have the same issue. And the issues some students may share from other cultural backgrounds, or even our domestic students, our indigenous students may share. So yeah, I think it's a reiteration of what I discussed at the very beginning. The goal is to focus on what we can do once we explore some of the reasons underneath our students' challenges. But the focus is what we can do. And yeah, it's a community effort we have to put in to support our students. Okay, I think we're getting better with our conversation. Let me quickly check the chat to see if I missed anything. Okay, I can see Karen says the idea of modeling that Ian raised is very important. In many cases, we ask students to write a research essay, but nowhere is the course, the skill of writing an essay was demonstrated or even discussed. Yes, exactly. Because sometimes we kind of assume, oh, when they come to my class, they already know. They know how to write the paper. They know my regulations. They should know, those rules and stuff. But oftentimes they may either coming from a different cultural background, they may interpret our rules and those regulations very differently, or just have very limited experience that could help them succeed in academic writing. Thank you so much for sharing. And Matt also said he loves the idea of modeling. I have cited my sources throughout the presentation as a modeling of proper. Oh, thank you so much. I'm trying to work my talk as well. And like I mentioned, while I'm reading those papers, I realized, oh, I know this already. Still, I have to cite the author of the paper. So that's one of my challenge. Okay, so let's quickly move on to the last but not the least point. In terms of the different norms of attribution, because there exists different attribution across our world. For instance, based on research study in Vietnam, the convention and accepted practice for acknowledging sources is by including a full list of sources in a bibliography at the end of the paper. And in some Asian countries, inclusion of an author's original work in quotation marks is sufficient enough, and the citation is not necessarily required. And also another research says copying some words verbatim instead of paraphrasing is accepted as a way to show respect for the original author, and partially copying or borrowing others' ideas or words might not be considered as plagiaristic. Okay, I remember I mentioned at the very beginning of the session today, I feel like I might not be able to exceed what the expert wrote. So I feel more comfortable using their words verbatim to not lose, the professionalism in the writing. But I also realize that will quickly get me in trouble because when I'm writing something that's not my idea, I have to give a proper citation. Okay, I wonder if there's anything our panelists or anybody in the session feels like sharing at this point. I quickly shared all the culture points I prepared. So what do you think? Do you have questions, comments, stories to share with us? Please go ahead.
I can take. So I have a story to tell. And so I told previously briefly that universities in developing countries has been adapting the academic integrity rules and regulations, and they are trying to teach their students to properly address those issues in their writings. But still, there is a significant gap here and there in terms of understanding the norms or how students should apply them. So I can remember that one specific issue that I had during my master thesis, which was in Persian, that I was allowed to translate a whole paragraph from another study and put it directly into my document. But I needed to mention the authors in the bibliography section. So my master's supervisor was okay with this practice. However, my internal and external examiner was like, hey, you cannot do this. You have to cite the authors into the text as well. And although that's, one might say, translation word by word is not allowed, but it turned out that in our university, it wasn't really that issue. And, paraphrasing, the whole idea was gone into the shadows because of the translation. So, because of that discussion between my supervisor and my examiners, I realized that, academic practices is very subjective, and especially in Iran, because it wasn't something that we could reach to a conclusion easily at that time. And especially figuring out what's common knowledge and what's not, and based on the what we've talked so far through the presentation, it was a challenging issues here and there in my thesis. So I realized that, being subjectivity is something that we needed to figure out somehow. But here, that's not a problem. And I'm happy to study in English right now. Yep.
Thank you so much, Amir. Matt, you have your video on. Does that mean you have something to share?
Not every time that my video is on, I have something to share, but this time I do. Well, a few years ago, I was teaching a communications course at Mohawk College in Hamilton. And as part of that, students needed to write a final paper, essay type of paper. And to prepare them for the citation practices, I would teach them in class how to cite and work off specific segments. But to get them more involved, I had workshop-like classes when I asked the students to come to class with the topics that they had already cleared with me and bring a laptop or tablet or something. Then during that session, I taught them how to search for reliable resources and evaluate their references. Then find the specific papers or resources, find the information, how to find the information they are looking for, and then how to cite them. Now, we practiced this a couple of times in the previous sessions, and then I asked them to find out that each student's subject for the essay is different. So they were searching on their computers frantically. And when they said, I said, okay, just write down something, you can just edit it later. And after a few minutes, a student raised their hand and I walked to her and she said, okay, sir, I have cited this. What do you think of that? I have paraphrased this. What do you think of that? I read it was a nice paraphrase. I said, oh, it looks great. So in a positive way, I tried to say, oh, just make sure that you cite your reference and that's perfect. And then she said, oh, but these are my own words. I mean, I paraphrase it. I said, yeah, sure. Just remember to cite it. And she said, so if I paraphrase it and I already have cited the resource in my reference list, so you're telling me that I still have to cite it in text? I looked at her, I thought like she's joking or something, but no, she was serious. I said, yes, we still need to cite that. And, oh, okay, thank you. I didn't know that. I said, come on. I didn't say that, but I thought, I told you a couple of times last week, the week before that. Anyway, I was walking around and somebody else raised their hand, similar scenario. So I realized my education in terms of doing it in small pieces wasn't effective completely. And students didn't know, although they didn't mean to plagiarize, they had their reference. In their reference list, they have paraphrased the source, and they thought it's fine. And they shouldn't, in fact, be citing that. They thought it would be wrong if they cite the source in the in-text, or if they paraphrase it. But then I demystified the fact, and I just showed them how to do it that way and what are the exact norms. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I was somehow remembered while you were sharing like my own story in terms of like, I think in my very first academic paper after I moved over for Canada for my degree, my instructor called me to her office and say, "Oh, do you know that you are using too many verbatim words in your paraphrasing?" And I was like confused. I'm like, "Oh, I paraphrased, but can you tell me how many words I can use from original sentence that it's not plagiarized, move, or I will be qualified for like a perfect paraphrasing?" So that links back to the definition of plagiarism in a general concept, which says when you use other people's words and ideas, you have to give proper attribution or proper citation, but this definition doesn't tell us more details in terms of how many words we can use. And as we mentioned, the common knowledge, like what if you already have this idea before you read a journal? So this is such a complex issue, plus secondary citation, plus self-plagiarism. So it may look a pretty clear concept when we really master this definition or we really grow as a professional. But when you are new to this context, it's so confusing. This issue will go on for a while unless there's an intention for the students to really practice and get feedback and have the courage to even make mistakes, so they will learn from their mistakes. But if we call up on them for the first mistake and we threaten them for like a punishment, then they will be afraid of making mistakes, but they're also not learning. They're not growing out of their experience. So that's something I think I would like to share based on my own experience. I can see here in the chat, Lauren says, "I wonder if these issues of plagiarism are evolving globally in the Web 2.0 digital age, when there is so much information documented online. There seem to be so few truly unique ideas. Everything is a remix. It seems an important learning and life skill to teach students to search for relevant information, shifts and quality sources, and remix or synthesize information is the idea of plagiarism and ownership of ideas seem antiquated. What do you all think? Is teaching plagiarism going to be extremely important in the future, or is it going to be the way of teaching curve handwriting or virtual extent? So thank you for the very long question, Lauren. There's so many different layers within your question. I want to hand the floor over to our panelists in terms of what do you think of Lauren's question and what the answers you have at this point.
I think this is an excellent question. It's interesting earlier that somebody said as well that the idea of common knowledge isn't static. The goalposts are constantly shifting. And one of the points I've been wanting to make throughout this session is that when we talk about plagiarism and citation practices, we're really talking about a very specific part of North American and English-speaking academia. And that is it. We're not talking about something that represents necessarily our culture as a whole, because these ideas about originality are relatively unique, relatively new, and don't really extend across the rest of culture. And when we were discussing this session, I made the point that, Western jazz musicians, for example, will often quote from each other, right? If you use a line from a Charlie Parker solo in your improvised solo, nobody is expecting you to attribute it, but it is considered brilliant and it's considered up to the listener to listen and kind of be on the inside and recognize that that's what you're doing. And it's funny you mentioned, Lauren, in your comment, the idea of remixing, that actually hip hop culture does the same thing, right? Borrowing samples, relentlessly reworking the same materials. And so it is very confusing for students when we talk about the idea that, of course, at Queen's and in Canada, we simply just cite and our version of originality is this, when actually that's not true. We're talking about academia's version in these English language journals and in this English language practice is restricted to this method of citation. So is teaching plagiarism going to be important in the future, or will we do away with it? I think it depends what becomes of academia itself. If the method changes, then the plagiarism tuition will follow and the plagiarism method will follow. But I certainly see, and this is, going way off and digressing quite deeply here. But for example, the issue of, in the humanities, where my background is, the idea of the single author monograph seems to be somewhat antiquated, and lots of people are interested in collective writing practices. And yet, if you're a graduate student and you're thinking about postdoc and ultimately getting tenure, you need that single author monograph and not some collective volume on your resume. So it all depends on structural requirements, it depends on cultural requirements, but I don't think academia will change very quickly to reflect what's going on in society outside of it.
Thank you so much, Ian, for sharing. I was kind of thinking, what's the fine line between intertextuality and, plagiarism? Do we have a fine line? It's also another complicated topic. I will stop talking. So I wonder if Matt or Amir have an idea to share based on Lauren's question.
So I'm going to reflect on Lauren's question in one way. So I can remember in 2019, Google announced that in the past 2 years, humanity have, generated much information as they did throughout the whole history. And I think this question makes sense. I mean, inevitably, you're going to produce and write something that somebody else has already written. And I was thinking about the same thing. So when you want to write about something that, I don't know, dozens and dozens of papers have already talked about it in their studies, so the likelihood of, writing in the same exact words is much more than before. So I guess, I don't know, but it's not my area of expertise, but I expect things to differ in the near future. That's my idea.
Thank you so much for sharing, Amir. Thank you so much, Lauren, for this very intriguing question. So let's move on to the next part. Before we start thinking about the strategies, start to reflecting our own practice, I would like to have a quick sum up. I just want to share that, first of all, we can't just blame it on the different cultures where our students come from if they don't yet know how to cite properly, because even if, this collectivism or imitation may compose common practices in some cultures, neither encourages plagiarism, okay? In the same light, while the academic citation practices of some cultures may differ from those of what we're doing in our context, students are still expected to cite sources in academic writing. It's the details of citation convention that are different. Okay, so that should be our teachable moment to our students. So the issue of plagiarism may also depend on the individual students and what students' academic experience might be, or even the nature of the task we ask our students to complete, right? So there's so much layers, so many different, a wide spectrum of reasons that complex the whole issue of plagiarism. And students who make mistakes in citation practices are very likely to be domestic, right? So like I already alluded, culture is not the only reason, but it is a reason that's worth our time to explore and study. when we have more international students coming to study on our campus across Canada, across North America, there also raise an intention that like says, oh, when they come, they just break our rules. They don't know what to do at all, and they are constant plagiarizers. So those comments really made me feel sad, right? Because I don't think the assumption is true that our international students do not understand or appreciate academic integrity. It is problematic. It's that most of the time, it's not their intention to, commit misconduct. I guess the focus really is on how we can work together to help them to make the best out of our education, to help them, adopt different skill sets to succeed in our specific contexts. Okay, so I think we had a wonderful conversation in terms of, cultural factors and your thoughts in terms of, the issue of plagiarism. I wonder, before we go to the next point in terms of strategy, any panelists or anybody in our group today feel like to share your last thoughts or questions?
Okay, sure. I share something. I turned on my camera. Well, as an educator, I want us to think about how we educate our students about citation norms and practices. Like, we hold them accountable for proper citation, for proper studies, and then manners during the exams, etc., etc. But how do we educate them on citation to avoid plagiarism by the end of semester or any time during the term? I want to just think about by telling them, we cannot say that we educated them. By putting it in the course outline, putting that academic integrity statement on the course outline, education does not occur. That's necessary, but that's not even close to enough. So modeling is one way. Another way is embedding academic integrity into the course. And like myself, I had taught my students how to cite. I had taught them how to paraphrase, at the example of Mohawk College that I told you. I have taught them that when you paraphrase, you have to cite it, but I haven't taught them holistically. Okay, find the resources, find the information, paraphrase it, cite it there, and put the citation at the end of the reference, at the end of the paper in the reference list. So that approach, I would say, is necessary, and we need to think about that in our education of our students.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate when you talk about the holistic way we use to educate our students, to really involve the why, what, and how. And maybe this is going to be an ongoing thinking for all of us to think of how we can possibly use indigenous knowledges or pedagogies that will help us, provide holistic way of teaching and learning. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for your contribution to the session. I think it's time for us to have a group discussion in terms of strategies. Okay, my colleague Sandra will share a link in the chat. So you will get a document from the link. So I put together a few strategies based on the readings I've done. And what I would hope we can do at this point is to discuss within a small group, 3 or 4, to identify at least one strategy you want to try in your own practice. The strategy can be from the documents I prepared, or could be from something you heard from your peers in a discussion. So the link is already in the chat, and Sandra is going to put us in group discussions. So please feel free to click the link and get the document before going to the discussion. And we have about 10 minutes for the discussion. Okay, I'll see you after that. Okay, it seems to me everyone is back. I hope you had a fruitful conversation with your peers in the breakout session. And I hope you can still see my PowerPoint. I will hand the floor over back to Ian and Matt to quickly talk about a few strategies or share some highlights from your discussion. So Matt or Ian, do you want to take over from now?
I wasn't in one of the discussion rooms because I've been teaching since 8:30 without a break, so I had to take a break quickly. My brain is beginning to run on empty. Does anyone have any thoughts on this modeling issue and how to model well? Because I certainly do, but I'm interested to hear what other people thought. Matt?
At least we can model the way in our presentations, make sure that we cite our references properly and provide the citation list at the end. So if students need to find more information, they don't have to juggle through it. That's one way to do that.
I think in terms of the modeling, firstly, I mean, we can come into classrooms and do this with you students. And, you know, if you go on to other institutions, you will have writing centers who can do the same thing. I would say, imagine how much benefit your students would get from you spending 10 or 15 minutes at the beginning of a class, breaking apart a paragraph or a page of writing and showing, here is exactly why the references are the way they are. Right, here's why we've elected to include a reference or elected not to include a reference when we're talking about disciplinary common knowledge. Because so often we just tell students the destination without giving them the path to the journey. And then if you did that early in the semester and then consistently referred to it throughout the course, right, you know, just once every couple of weeks, once every week, just say, oh, look, there's the reference like you talked about. Your students will know what to expect. They'll know how to do things. And then when exceptions and sort of oddities come up, you'll be able to discuss them as you go rather than putting all of the burden on the students. And I think especially that kind of strategy works well because it treats all the students as equals. Like I was saying, it's not the fact that Chinese students have one conception of academic integrity and Canadian students have another. It's that almost nobody understands what we're asking them to do within this very bounded context of a Canadian university. So consistently showing them throughout treats them all as if they have a solid foundation of some sort that gives them opportunities to ask questions and understand what's expected.
Yeah, and I would like to continue on that to make the connection. When we want to model, the next step would be to make the connection between each value of academic integrity to each course that you have. So the pretty much globally accepted definition of academic integrity is by International Center of Academic Integrity. And the most recent reference is 2021. I'm modeling my way. Is that it's adherence and commitment to the 6 values of honesty, trust, fairness, respect, responsibility, and courage. So how can we promote each one of them in each of our courses? As an example, we are honest with the students, giving them the course objectives at the beginning of each class and say, this is what we expect from you to learn from this class. And then in 2 weeks, we are going to measure your learning this way. So this way, we are honest with what we expect from students to accomplish, and we build trust. If we adhere to that honest principle, we follow through to the next step. And this story continues. If we make mistakes, we are honest with that. We take courage, another value, to basically say, oh, we made a mistake, or scientists made a mistake here, and this is what came up. And et cetera, et cetera. That's how we can promote that. The other thing is, how can we promote each value within each course? How can we do that? We need to think about that. And then how can we scaffold the students? I give you one example about citation of scaffolding. That I said I had a workshop for students. They came to class with their own topics, and now they had to search online, learn about how to percolate different resources into more reliable resources, and then find the information and cite them. What other ways are there, or we can think of that we can promote or we can scaffold academic integrity practices. And I want to open it. I was trying to be quick on mentioning my ideas, my 2 cents on each one of these. And I want to open the floor to other comments. Think about these questions. And if you have any ideas, please share with us.
Okay, thank you so much. I have so much still I want to share and talk. I'm also very sensitive of the time. So it's 12 o'clock already, which means it comes to the end of the session, but the conversation just started. I will be inviting everybody back, maybe next semester, to have another conversation, not like a workshop, but just a conversation to share our thoughts and ideas, like what we can do, what we can help each other to help our students. So as I promised, there are a few resources put together either by Matt's office or by Ian's office, and there will be emails. We can reach out to our panelists. If you are interested in this conversation, please also feel free to email me to continue our conversation. Thank you so much for your engagement. It's my great pleasure to have you all in my session today. I hope you can all be my ally in terms of spreading the word so we know our international students, our diverse students, they are in charge and they're in challenge, and how can we work together to help them. Thank you so much, and hope you enjoy your lovely lunch, and I'll see you in another session.